He thought he was removing a problem from the courtroom, but he was about to remove his own career instead. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the packed courtroom as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his presence loud even before he spoke, his boots echoing across the polished floor like he owned every inch of it. And maybe he believed he did, because when his eyes landed on Ava Carter sitting quietly near the front row, something in his expression shifted, a mix of irritation and certainty, the kind that comes from never being questioned. "You need to leave," he said sharply, loud. Enough for half the room to turn and watch. But Ava didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't even look surprised. She just lifted her eyes slowly, calm, steady, like she had already seen this moment play out before. And that stillness only seemed to irritate him more, because he stepped closer, his voice tightening. "I'm not asking again." And now people were whispering, shifting in their seats, the tension spreading like a ripple through water. But no one stepped in, not the bailiff, not the clerk, not even the judge who glanced up briefly before looking back down at his papers. And that silence said everything. It told Brooks he was in control. It told the room this was normal, just another moment no one would question. But Ava remained exactly where she was, her hands folded neatly, her posture composed, her gaze locked onto his without fear, and for a split second, something almost unnoticeable flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe, or something deeper he couldn't quite name. But it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by a firm grip as he reached for her arm, guiding her up from her seat, not violently, not dramatically, but with a force that made it clear he wasn't used to being resisted. And still, she didn't resist. She simply stood, allowing the movement, allowing the moment, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood as he began leading her toward the exit, each step drawing more attention, more whispers, more eyes, until the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. And that's when it happened. Not a struggle, not a shout, but a pause, subtle, deliberate. Ava stopped walking, just for a second, just enough to break the rhythm. And in that single second, something shifted, like the air itself had changed direction. Brooks felt it before he understood it, the quiet confidence, the unshaken stillness, the sense that he wasn't the one in control anymore. And then she spoke, her voice low, measured, cutting through the tension like it had been waiting for the exact right moment. "Are you sure you want to do this, officer?" And for the first time, Daniel Brooks didn't answer right away, because something in that question didn't feel like defiance. It felt like a warning. And somewhere behind them, a door opened with a sound that echoed just a little too loudly in the silence. The sound of that door opening did not belong in a moment like this, not in a room that had already decided how the scene would end. And yet it cut through the air with quiet authority, drawing a few hesitant glances while Officer Daniel Brooks remained fixed in place, his hand still on Ava Carter's arm, but no longer guiding, no longer certain, because something had changed and he could feel it even if he could not explain it. The weight of the room shifting in a way that no badge or raised voice could control, and Ava did not pull away. She did not rush to explain herself. She simply stood there, composed, her posture steady as if she had been waiting for this exact second all along. And when she turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch the edge of what she held, the faint glint of metal became impossible to ignore, subtle but unmistakable, and Brooks followed that movement without thinking, his eyes narrowing as if his mind was trying to catch up to something his instincts had already realized. The whispers in the courtroom grew quieter now, not louder, because confusion had replaced judgment, and confusion had a way of silencing people, the kind of silence that spreads when something does not fit the narrative everyone had already accepted. Ava lifted her hand fully this time, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to bring the object into clear view. And the gold caught the fluorescent light in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words did not need to be spoken. They carried their own weight. And for the first time since he had stepped forward, Daniel Brooks did not look like a man in control. His grip loosened without him realizing it. Not out of fear, not yet, but out of hesitation, the kind that creeps in when certainty starts to crack. "You might want to rethink this," Ava said, her voice even, not raised, not confrontational, just calm. And that calmness was louder than anything else in the room, because it did not match the role he had assigned to her. It did not match the story he had already decided was true, and now the room was watching differently. Not as spectators expecting an outcome, but as witnesses unsure of what they were seeing. The judge looked up again, this time longer, his expression shifting ever so slightly. The clerk paused mid-note, a pen hovering above paper. Even the bailiff straightened, as if some unspoken line had just been crossed, and from behind them, footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain, the kind of steps that did not ask for attention but received it anyway. Brooks did not turn immediately, but the tension in his shoulders said he heard it, said he knew this moment was no longer his alone. And Ava finally moved, not away from him, not retreating, but pivoting just enough to face the center of the room again, reclaiming the space she had been forced out of only seconds before. And in that movement there was no anger, no triumph, just quiet authority, the kind that did not need to prove itself because it already knew what it was. And that was when the voice came, firm, unmistakable. Agent Carter, it said, and the name landed heavier than any accusation, heavier than any command, because it confirmed what the badge had only suggested. And in that instant, the entire room understood that this was not a disruption, this was something else entirely, something planned, something larger. And Daniel Brooks finally let go completely, his hand falling back to his side, as if it no longer belonged where it had been. And though no one spoke it out loud, the question hung in the air, not what just happened, but how far this was about to go. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because Agent Carter carried a weight that pressed down on every corner of the courtroom. And suddenly the space that had felt routine, almost predictable, no longer belonged to the people who thought they controlled it. The man who stepped forward from the doorway was not in uniform, not in a robe, but there was something about the way he moved, steady, deliberate, that made people shift in their seats without knowing why. His eyes scanned the room once, taking in the judge, the officers, the silent crowd, before settling briefly on Ava Carter, a subtle nod passing between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to confirm what had already begun to unravel. And that quiet exchange said more than any explanation could. Daniel Brooks felt it like a pressure building behind his ribs, not panic, not yet, but the uncomfortable awareness that the situation was no longer following the path he had expected. And when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the sharp certainty it had carried before. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, though the question sounded less like a challenge and more like a search for something stable to hold on to. The man from the doorway did not rush to answer. He stepped further into the room, his presence filling the silence in a way that demanded attention without raising his voice. "This," he said calmly, "is where things start to become clear." And that word, clear, seemed to ripple through the room, because nothing about the moment felt clear to anyone who had been watching just minutes ago. The judge leaned back slightly, his posture no longer as relaxed as it had been, the subtle shift of his shoulders revealing a growing awareness that whatever was happening was not part of the usual proceedings. Ava remained composed, her gaze steady, not focused on Brooks anymore, but on the room itself, as if she was no longer reacting to it, but observing it. And that shift in her attention changed everything, because it placed her above the moment instead of inside it. Brooks noticed it, even if he did not fully understand it, and that realization unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. "If you have something to say, you say it now," he insisted, trying to regain control, but the words felt thinner this time, less anchored, and the man simply nodded once, acknowledging the attempt without giving it power. "For the past 6 months," he began, his tone measured, "this courtroom, along with several individuals connected to it, has been part of an ongoing federal review." And the air seemed to tighten instantly, the word federal landing heavier than anything that had come before, because it expanded the moment beyond the room, beyond the building, into something far larger. Whispers did not rise this time. They disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate, almost cautious. Ava did not move, did not react outwardly, but there was a shift in her presence, subtle, undeniable, as if the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface was finally stepping forward. "Agent Carter has been assigned to observe, document, and report," the man continued, his eyes briefly meeting Brooks again. not with hostility, but with something far more unsettling, certainty. And everything that has happened here today, he added, letting the words settle without rushing them, has already been recorded. And that was the moment Daniel Brooks understood, not fully, not all at once, but enough to feel the ground beneath his assumptions begin to crack, because this was no longer about one decision, one action, one moment in a courtroom. This was about something that had been building long before he ever stepped forward, and now every eye in the room was no longer watching Ava Carter as a suspect, but as the center of something much bigger, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was waiting. The word recorded did not echo, but it settled into the room like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or explained away. And for the first time since he had stepped forward, Daniel Brooks felt the absence of control instead of the presence of it, because everything he had done, every word, every decision, now existed outside of him, preserved somewhere he could not reach, could not change, and that realization did not come with noise. It came quietly, tightening the space around him as the courtroom shifted its attention completely, no longer waiting for him to act, but watching to see what would happen next. The judge cleared his throat softly, a small sound that felt unusually loud in the stillness, his hand hovering near the gavel but not striking it, as if even he understood that the usual signals of authority no longer applied in the same way. Ava Carter remained exactly where she stood, centered, composed, her presence steady like something that had been anchored long before this moment began. She did not look at Brooks with anger. She did not look at him with satisfaction. She simply looked through the moment, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this room. And that calm unsettled him more than any accusation could have, because it left no space for negotiation, no space for control, only for realization. "You are saying this was planned," Brooks finally said, his voice lower now, measured, but lacking the edge it once carried. The man from the doorway did not rush his response. He allowed the question to sit for a brief moment, as if letting Brooks hear it himself, understand what he was truly asking. "I am saying," he replied, his tone steady, "that what happens when people believe no one is watching often tells the truth better than anything else." And that sentence did not accuse. It revealed. It placed the focus not on a single action, but on a pattern, something larger, something that extended beyond this one moment. And the weight of that idea spread through the room, subtle but undeniable. The clerk slowly lowered her pen, no longer pretending to continue writing. The bailiff shifted his stance again, more alert now, as if unsure of where his role fit into what was unfolding. And the judge finally leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer distant, but engaged, calculating, because even he understood that this was no longer routine. Ava took a small step forward then, not toward Brooks, not toward the exit, but toward the center of the space that had once pushed her out, reclaiming it without force, without announcement. And when she spoke, her voice carried clearly, not raised, not dramatic, but precise. "Every interaction matters," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the room, not accusing, but acknowledging, "especially the ones people think will be forgotten." And there was something in that line that made several people shift in their seats, because it reached beyond the present moment, beyond the visible, into something personal, something reflective. Brooks felt it as well, not as a direct challenge, but as a mirror he had not expected to face. And for a brief second, he looked around the courtroom, not as someone in control, but as someone trying to understand how quickly that control had disappeared. The man from the doorway stepped beside Ava now, not in front of her, not above her, but aligned, reinforcing what had already been made clear without saying it directly. "We are not here to disrupt," he continued calmly. "We are here to make sure that what is supposed to stand for justice actually reflects it." And that statement did not land as a threat. It landed as something final, something that did not require agreement to exist. And in the silence that followed, the roles in the room had fully shifted, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful, clarity. And for Daniel Brooks, standing in the center of it, the realization settled in slowly but unmistakably. This was not a moment he could move past. This was a moment that would follow him long after the courtroom emptied. The word clarity did not bring comfort to the room. It brought exposure. the kind that strips away assumptions and leaves only what is real. And for Daniel Brooks, standing under the same fluorescent lights that once felt like they belonged to him, that exposure felt heavier with every passing second, because the silence around him was no longer passive. It was observant, deliberate, and filled with a quiet judgment that no uniform could shield him from. He shifted his weight slightly, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but in a room where every detail now mattered. It felt amplified, like the first crack in something that had once seemed unbreakable. His eyes moved across the courtroom again. But this time they did not search for compliance. They searched for understanding, and what he found instead were faces that no longer reflected certainty. The same people who had remained still moments ago now looked at him differently, not as an authority figure, but as part of something being examined. And that shift was irreversible. Ava Carter stood at the center of it all, not elevated, not dramatic, just steady, as if the gravity of the moment did not need to be forced. It simply existed, her presence anchoring the space in a way that felt undeniable. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision. "This was never about one moment," she said, her words landing softly but clearly. "It is about what those moments reveal when no one thinks they will matter." And the statement did not accuse directly, but it opened something deeper, something that extended beyond the room, beyond the individuals present, into a system that relied on moments going unnoticed. Brooks felt that meaning settle in, not as a direct attack, but as something harder to confront, because it required reflection, and reflection was not something he had prepared for. Not here, not like this. The man beside Ava stepped forward slightly, his posture still composed, his tone unchanged. "There are procedures that follow from here," he said, not as a threat, but as a certainty. "And they will proceed as they are meant to." And there was something final in that statement, something that did not invite argument. The judge finally straightened fully in his seat, the hesitation from before replaced by a careful, measured awareness. "This court will cooperate fully," he said, his voice controlled, but no longer distant. And that acknowledgement carried its own weight, because it marked the moment the room itself accepted what was unfolding, not as a disruption, but as something legitimate, something necessary. The clerk resumed writing, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if each word carried more importance than before. The bailiff remained still, his earlier uncertainty replaced by quiet attention, and the audience, once filled with murmurs, remained silent, not out of fear, but out of recognition that they were witnessing something that extended beyond routine. Brooks exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath. And in that small release, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. The tension in his shoulders easing not because the situation had resolved, but because it had clarified. He looked at Ava. Again, not with the same certainty, not with the same assumption, but with something closer to recognition, as if seeing her fully for the first time. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by authority, but by understanding, though it came too late to change what had already been set in motion. Ava met his gaze briefly, not lingering, not emphasizing, just enough to acknowledge the moment before letting it pass. Because for her, this was not personal, it was purposeful, and that distinction was what made it powerful. The man beside her gave a slight nod, and though no one announced it, the direction of the moment was clear. The focus was no longer on what had happened, but on what would follow. And as the courtroom remained still, holding on to the weight of everything that had just unfolded, one truth settled quietly but firmly into place. Some moments do not end when they are over. They begin something that cannot be undone. The room did not return to normal, because something fundamental had already shifted, and even as people adjusted in their seats or glanced at one another, there was a shared understanding that what had just happened could not be reduced to routine or dismissed as a misunderstanding. It had exposed something deeper, something that lingered in the air like a question no one could ignore. Daniel Brooks remained standing where he was, but the space around him no longer felt like his to command. It felt observed, measured, and quietly evaluated, and that awareness settled in slowly, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual weight that pressed against his certainty. He looked toward the judge, expecting direction, expecting structure to return, but what he saw instead was caution, a careful distance, as if even the bench itself was recalibrating its role in this moment. The man beside Ava Carter checked his watch briefly, not out of impatience, but as part of a process already in motion, and that small gesture carried more meaning than any raised voice could have, because it suggested that time here was no longer being controlled by the courtroom, but by something beyond it. Ava remained steady, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer questioned but acknowledged, and yet she did not take control in a visible way. She did not demand attention. She allowed the moment to unfold, and that restraint made her authority even more undeniable. Brooks finally spoke again, but his voice had shifted, the sharpness replaced by something more measured. "What happens now?" he asked, and the question was no longer rhetorical. It was genuine. The man turned slightly toward him, his expression calm, but not detached. "Now," he said, "everything continues exactly as it should have from the beginning." And that answer did not provide details. It provided direction, the kind that could not be redirected by force or interrupted by argument. The clerk resumed her notes with a steadier hand. The bailiff stepped into a more formal stance, and the judge leaned forward, his voice returning, but carrying a different tone. "Proceed," he said, not as a dismissal, but as an acknowledgement that the process must move forward under new clarity. And as those words settled, Ava took her seat again, not as someone returning to a lower position, but as someone who had never truly left her place. The simple act of sitting down carried a quiet finality, as if restoring balance to a space that had momentarily tilted. Brooks watched that movement closely, and in it he saw something he had not recognized before. Not defiance, not resistance, but certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it is already grounded in something stronger than perception. The man beside her remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze scanning the room once more before stepping back, not leaving, but allowing the space to breathe again. And slowly, almost cautiously, the courtroom began to move. Papers were adjusted, chairs shifted, voices returned in low, controlled tones, but nothing felt the same. Every action carried an awareness that had not been there before, and for Brooks, standing at the edge of it all, that awareness followed him, settling into his thoughts in a way he could not ignore, because for the first time, he was not thinking about control. He was thinking about consequence, and that shift, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of something far more lasting than the moment itself, something that would not be resolved with a single decision or a single day, something that would continue long after the room emptied, long after the voices faded, because once a moment like this reveals what it reveals, it does not disappear, it stays, shaping everything that comes after in ways no one in that room could fully predict yet. The rhythm of the courtroom had returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm. It moved slower, more deliberate, like every sound had to pass through a layer of awareness before it could exist. The faint shuffle of papers, the quiet clearing of a throat, even the subtle creak of a chair carried a weight that had not been there before. And in the center of it all, Ava Carter sat with the same calm composure, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her eyes focused not on any single person, but on the process itself, as if that was where her attention had always belonged. The judge began to speak again, outlining the next steps of the hearing, but his tone had shifted, no longer distant or routine, now measured, intentional, each word chosen with care, as though he understood that every detail now mattered more than it ever had. Daniel Brooks remained standing for a moment longer before finally stepping back to his position, but the movement did not restore what had been lost. It only confirmed it, because the authority he once carried so easily now felt conditional, dependent on something beyond his control, and he could feel the difference in how the room responded to him, not with resistance, but with a quiet distance, a subtle separation that had not existed before. He glanced toward Ava again, but this time his gaze did not linger. It shifted away quickly, as if he was not yet ready to fully confront what that moment had revealed. The man who had entered earlier remained near the doorway, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, not intrusive, but unmistakably part of the room now, as if he had always been there, simply unseen until this point. The proceedings continued, voices rising and falling in controlled exchanges. But beneath it all there was an undercurrent, something unspoken that connected every person present, The awareness that what had been exposed could not be ignored, that it would follow each of them beyond this space. Ava listened carefully, occasionally making a note, her movements precise and minimal, never drawing attention to herself, yet impossible to overlook, because the context had changed, and in that new context, even the smallest action carried meaning. Brooks tried to focus on the hearing, on the structure, on the familiar flow of procedure, but his thoughts kept circling back, not to the moment itself, but to what it represented, the realization that control was not something that could simply be assumed, that authority without awareness could shift in an instant, and that once it did, there was no easy way to return to what had been before. He adjusted his stance again, more out of habit than necessity. But even that felt different now, as if he was aware of being observed in a way he had never considered before. The judge called for a brief pause, a moment to review documents. And as the room settled into a quieter state, the silence returned, but it was not empty. It was reflective, carrying with it everything that had unfolded. Ava leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting for a moment, not toward any person, but toward the space itself, as if taking in the full scope of what had just been set into motion. And in that brief pause, the contrast became clear. While others were adjusting to the moment, she had already moved beyond it, already positioned for what came next, and that difference was what made her presence so powerful, not because she demanded attention, but because she did not need to. The man near the doorway checked his watch once more, then looked toward Ava, a subtle exchange passing between them again, one that spoke of timing, of sequence, of steps already planned. And as the judge prepared to resume, the room felt poised on the edge of something else, something that had not yet been revealed, because while the truth of the moment had already surfaced, its full impact had not yet been felt, and somewhere in that quiet tension, a single realization settled in. This was not the end of what had begun, it was only the point where everything started to take shape. The judge's gavel came down softly, not as a command, but as a signal, and the courtroom leaned back into motion. Yet the motion felt different now, like every step forward carried the memory of what had already been revealed. The documents were passed, voices resumed, but there was a precision in every word that had not existed before, a careful awareness that nothing in this room was invisible anymore. Ava Carter sat still, her pen moving across the page in short, deliberate strokes, capturing details that others might overlook. But now, no one was certain what could be overlooked anymore. Because the line between routine and consequence had been erased, Daniel Brooks stood at his post, but his attention was no longer anchored to the surface of the proceedings. It drifted beneath, circling back to the realization that the structure he had trusted without question had just shown him its limits. He listened as the attorneys spoke, their voices measured, their arguments structured, but even they seemed aware of the shift, their tone less performative, more exact, as if they understood that this was no longer just a case being argued, but a moment being documented. The man near the doorway stepped forward again, not interrupting, but positioning himself where he could observe clearly, his presence quiet yet undeniable, reinforcing the sense that this was not an isolated review. It was part of something broader, something that extended beyond the walls of this building. The judge paused mid-sentence, glancing briefly at Ava, then at the man standing nearby, a subtle exchange of understanding passing between them before he continued. And in that glance, the hierarchy of the room adjusted once more, not overtly, but enough to be felt. Brooks noticed it, and the awareness settled deeper, because it confirmed what he had begun to understand, that authority here was no longer defined by position alone, but by accountability. And that shift carried consequences he could not yet fully measure. The hearing moved forward, each piece of testimony, each statement, now framed within a context that made every detail matter more. Ava listened, her focus unwavering, but there was a quiet intensity behind it, not urgency, but purpose, as if she was not just recording what was happening, but connecting it to something larger, something already in motion. Brooks found himself watching her again, not directly, but in the spaces between actions, trying to understand how someone could stand in the center of such a shift without reacting outwardly. And the answer came not in what she did, but in what she did not do. She did not seek control. She did not raise her voice. She allowed the truth of the moment to carry itself, and that restraint gave her more authority than anything he had relied on before. The courtroom paused again as a new document was introduced, the air tightening slightly, not with tension, but with anticipation. Because now every new element felt like it could reveal something further, the man stepped closer to the bench, speaking briefly with the judge in a low tone, their conversation inaudible to the room, but its effect immediate. The judge straightened, nodding once before addressing the courtroom again. "We will proceed with the additional materials," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that acknowledged the significance of what was unfolding. Brooks felt that weight settle again, not as pressure, but as clarity. The understanding that this was no longer about maintaining order. It was about facing what had already been set into motion. Ava closed her notebook for a brief moment, her gaze lifting, not toward any single person, but across the room as a whole, and in that glance there was something that resonated beyond the present, a quiet recognition that this moment was only one part of a larger sequence. The courtroom resumed, but the energy had shifted once more, no longer reactive, now intentional, as if every person present understood that they were not just participating in a hearing, they were part of something being revealed piece by piece. And as the voices continued, measured and controlled, one thing became clear in the silence between them: whatever came next would not simply conclude this moment, it would define everything that followed. The courtroom no longer felt like a place where outcomes were decided in isolation. It felt like a space where something much larger was unfolding piece by piece. And as the proceedings continued, that awareness settled deeper into every person present. The judge reviewed the newly introduced materials with a focus that had replaced his earlier detachment, his eyes moving carefully across each page as if weighing not just the information itself, but what it represented. The attorneys adjusted their approach, their voices steady but more deliberate, choosing words with precision rather than habit, because now every statement carried the possibility of being seen beyond this room. Ava Carter reopened her notebook, her pen moving again, but slower this time, more selective, as if the pattern she had been tracing was becoming clearer. Daniel Brooks stood still, his posture controlled, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the routine he had relied on for years. He was no longer watching the hearing as an enforcer of order. He was watching it as someone beginning to understand the difference between authority and accountability. And that difference did not come with instruction, it came with realization. The man near the bench stepped back slightly, allowing the process to continue without interruption. Yet his presence remained a constant reminder that this moment extended beyond the visible. The judge paused once more, lifting his gaze across the courtroom, and for a brief second, the room fell completely silent, not because it was required, but because it was understood. "We will take a brief recess," he said finally, his tone measured, but carrying a quiet acknowledgement that this was no ordinary session. And as the gavel sounded again, softer than before, the structure of the room loosened. People shifted, stood, moved, but the energy did not dissipate. It lingered, carried in the glances exchanged, in the careful distance people now kept from one another. Ava remained seated for a moment longer, closing her notebook with a quiet motion, her expression unchanged, but her presence still grounded, as if she was not stepping out of the moment, but carrying it forward. Brooks hesitated before moving, his instinct telling him to step away, to return to something familiar. But there was no clear path back to what had been. He looked toward Ava again, this time not with uncertainty, but with something closer to understanding, though it remained incomplete, because the full scope of what had been revealed had not yet fully settled. Ava stood then, adjusting her posture with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning. And as she turned slightly, her eyes met his for just a second, not long enough to create tension, not short enough to dismiss. And in that moment, there was no accusation, no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been set into motion. The man approached her again, speaking in a low voice, and she nodded once. A simple confirmation that whatever came next was already understood between them. Around them, the courtroom continued to shift into recess. But even in movement, the sense of observation remained, because no one could fully separate themselves from what they had just witnessed. Brooks finally stepped aside, his position no longer defined by command, but by reflection, and as he did, the realization settled in more firmly than before. This was not about a single action. It was about a pattern that had been seen, recorded, and now understood in a way that could not be undone. Ava moved toward the exit, not rushed, not delayed, her pace steady, her presence unchanged, and as she reached the doorway, she paused briefly, not to look back, but as if marking the moment, then continued forward, leaving behind a room that was no longer the same as when she had entered it. And in that quiet transition, one truth remained. The law had not changed that day, but the way it was seen, the way it was held, and the way it would be carried forward had shifted, and for those who had been in that room, including Daniel Brooks, that shift would not fade. It would follow them, shaping what came next in ways they were only beginning to understand.